You're listening to Stealing from Wizards, Volume 4, Arson, by R.A. Consul. Chapter 1, Avalon. To the common observer, Avalon Island is wholly unremarkable, except perhaps in it being exceptionally inhospitable. It sits quite alone in the frigid and choppy waters of Hudson Bay, out of sight of any other piece of land large enough to perch on. The island itself is largely barren, a jumble of exposed rock covered in the leavings of the many seabirds nesting there. The closest thing to a permanent resident on the island is a single dedicated ornithologist, who has a small cottage hidden away within the island's single stand of trees. Yet neither Dr. Danielle Mercer nor the ptarmigan she studies stay for the summer. They have better places to be while the weather is good. To an uncommon observer, however, Avalon Island is perhaps the most remarkable place on the continent. Those peculiar few might see, at the point where its single freshwater creek drains into the salty waters of the bay, a shimmering film wafting in the air, like a gossamer curtain made from the swirling colors on the surface of a bubble. That veil marks a gateway between worlds. Beyond any such portal lies the fairy realm, a magical mirror version of the bland, magic-free world outside. Through this portal, in particular, is a locale unique even within the fairy realm. The space is so warped by the colliding magical fields that the island is smaller around than it is across, and the seasons change by location rather than by month. Despite the static seasons, a broad and ancient forest thrives. The trees don't seem to mind or notice that some are trapped in perpetual winter, while others are in continual bloom. At its center is a butte, a granite pillar too tall and narrow to be natural, and too jagged and marbled to be artificial. It rises above even the tallest trees, sometimes scraping the bottom of low-lying clouds. So obviously incredible is Avalon that one can hardly blame wizards for claiming it. On it, they erected grand buildings of governmental importance, embassies, a parliament, and such. So inconvenient is it to travel to that one can hardly blame them for abandoning that endeavor and turning it into a school, the complaints of children being much less worthy of consideration than those of nobles and diplomats. Its isolation is also advantageous as it keeps wizard kids contained and away from polite society during their most troublesome years. The most troublesome of its students, by a considerable margin, was Kuro. While most children were learning to read and write, he'd been learning to pick locks and pockets. While others were playing sports and making friends, he was scaling buildings and burgling apartments. His criminal nature had most recently resulted in him escaping from prison, only to break into a palace and kidnap a princess. The imprisonment was technically unjust, given that the warden was secretly Claudius Roche, the most wanted criminal in the Three Kingdoms. Kuro's kidnapping of the princess was broadly celebrated, as the princess in question was his friend Marie, and she was being held against her will by her own regent, who was also secretly Claudius Roche. While Kuro's recent actions were not actually criminal, the fact that he had done them made a lot of wizards uncomfortable. He was just a student, after all, and not a very good one. He shouldn't be outperforming experienced knights, who were the sort of people meant to be rescuing princesses. If asked, he would argue that the only thing he'd done that a proper wizard hadn't was try. In the process, he also had the audacity to discover that Roche had made copies of himself by taking over the minds and bodies of people in positions of power. That a teenage criminal uncovered that secret, and not highly trained members of the Royal Guard, was a bit embarrassing to say the least. And so, being the most troublesome of youth, Kuro was kept on Avalon Island even as all the other students, staff, and faculty were sent home for the summer. Officially, it was so he could make up for the classes he had missed while on the run from the law at the end of the previous school year. It was perfectly possible, however, to teach a single struggling student at the Bytown orphanage, where he had spent his previous summers. He was being kept on Avalon because it was safer. He was trapped there, out of sight and out of mind. A preferable situation for everyone, Kuro included. He really didn't mind. he also wasn't trapped. Humans are unusual creatures. Much like cats, crows, foxes, and spiders, a select few can exist in both worlds, passing between the magical and the mundane. They can also see the threshold between those worlds. From within the fairy realm, that border appears along any saltwater coast. Anyone straying too close to the shore can fairly easily tumble out of the fairy and into the bland, only finding their way back in where the veil thins and tears. Natives of the fairy realm, dragons, pixies, lutin, and such, cannot leave, nor even perceive the other world. Some doubt it even exists. To them, the shimmering sheet that humans see along the ocean coasts is a myth, a fanciful human tale. The land simply continues on. The fact that the ground washes back and forth as if carried along waves is no more strange to them than the changing shapes of clouds. That the distance between things should stay constant is a silly notion for people with poor senses of direction. Kuro, being neither fairy nor wizard, belonged in neither world. A side effect of him being a largely failed experiment in creating a half-lutin, half-wizard hybrid was that his poor relationship with laws extended beyond the criminal and into the physical. The border between worlds existed, but only so long as he was paying attention. With adequate distraction, he could walk through the fairy realm as one of the fair folk. That fact was not public knowledge. Few knew of Kuro's abilities, and they had their reasons to keep it a secret. Two were his friends. Charlie and Arthur learned of his capacity to leave Avalon when he had done so with them in his satchel. They knew that wizards barely tolerated his continued existence to begin with. If it came to light that he was no longer contained, he might find himself caged or erased. His friends were, at least for now, opposed to that. Two others were his fellow escapees from Niflheim prison, Marie's mother and Ms. Beatrice Crawley. Marie's mother held many secrets. She was secretly a changeling, the former queen's body double, and a double agent for the fairy court. She kept those and seemed to think it was useful to keep Kuro's as well. On one hand, it was leverage to have over him, and on the other, it meant her adopted daughter had a backdoor off Avalon should she ever need it. Ms. Crawley was particularly inclined to keep Kuro's secret, as she too was being held captive on Avalon Island. She had been imprisoned in Niflheim for the heinous crime of helping to create Kuro. That sentence had been commuted, reduced to a form of community service. She was being held on Avalon and forced to teach children magic. That is, she was made to do her old job as punishment, the logic being that working with 12 to 15-year-olds without pay was at least as harsh as any prison. There was one more person who fully understood what Kuro could do, one who, by all counts, should be the person most concerned with keeping him contained, Sir Talon Dubois, Knight Commander of the Canine Unit of the Royal Guard. Their relationship was complicated, to say the least. It's hard to really get along when one of the pair keeps causing trouble for the other. If asked, both would accuse the other of being the villain in that regard. Talon had repeatedly forced Kuro into various forms of imprisonment, and had hounded him across both the fairy realm and the Blandlands, and Kuro caused a terrible amount of paperwork for Talon. Nonetheless, they had an understanding. In the mutually beneficial effort to avoid interacting with each other, Kuro would stay put on Avalon so long as he was left alone and well fed. That arrangement resulted in Kuro's best summer to date. Not that the competition was stiff, but he had learned to appreciate what little he had while he had it. Avalon was wonderful with nobody else on it. During the school year, Kuro had thoroughly explored the places other people avoided. He had favorite elephant ferns to climb on in the spring quarter, on which he could lounge while electric newts hunted minnows in the swamp below. There were ledges on the summer cliffs where he could sit and watch the Vale dance on the waves, just barely out of arm's reach. When he needed complete peace, the winter quarter had forests of spruce trees eternally caked in snow, which soaked up all the sound and left him alone with his thoughts. And of course, there was his home in autumn, where the rustling leaves and musty scents of gentle decay hugged him like a cozy blanket. With everyone gone, though, he could explore the places people didn't avoid. It was forbidden to enter another residence without invitation and escort. That was quite reasonable for reasons of privacy and theft prevention, though a bit onerous for someone who had never paid much attention to either. With the residents gone, there was no such prohibition, at the very least not one that had been passed along to Kuro. He considered, as he wandered the empty halls and developed opinions on the relative comfort of his fellow students' mattresses, that folk rarely made rules against things that had never happened. In an effort to keep anyone from considering the need to invent a new policy, he ensured he left no trace of his passing. He smoothed sheets, swept floors, and relocked doors behind him. Summerhill residence, home to the students of the southern kingdom of Tirnanog, had too much of everything. The wallpaper, too much pattern. The floors, too much wax. The cushions, too much stuffing. The curtains, too much fabric. The rooms, despite being twice the size of the ones in Autumn Lodge, felt smaller due to the clutter of cabinets, chairs, lamps, shelves, and desks. While Summerhill might have been slightly claustrophobic, it was at least a place clearly meant to be lived in. The residence for the children from Acadia, in the east, Le Château de Printemps, felt more like a work of art than a home for students. Soaring marble architecture, stained glass windows, crystal chandeliers, and gilded wainscoting screamed, "Do not touch." Their beds, though, were much more welcoming than those of their summer counterparts. The Summerhill beds were barely softer than the parquet flooring on which they sat, acting as anvils on which to hammer out the appropriately stiff posture of the respectable citizens of Tirnanog. The mattresses of Spring were like oversized marshmallows. One could sink so deeply into their downy softness as to require rescue. Wertheim was altogether different. Folk from Alfheim, in the north, in the snow, put a lot less stock in privacy. There was warmth and light and community, something their long, dark winters otherwise lacked. They ate and slept all together in a single massive hall, nestled in firs around long fire pits, whose ever-burning embers fought away the relentless cold of their quarter. Even their baths were communal, huge stone pools filled and heated by underground springs. While Kuro could not comment on the communal experience, he could confirm that floating in the mineral-rich waters, breathing the heady steam, could soak away even the deepest chill. None could compare, however, to Autumn Lodge. The other residences would have been offended by even attempting such a comparison. The beds were lumpy, the windows drafty, the floors creaky. Even so, despite having free rein to claim any spot on the whole island to lay his head, Kuro found himself returning again and again to his squat log cabin half buried in fallen leaves. It was home. For the first few weeks of summer, it was his alone. He shared the lodge only with an artificial raccoon. Autolycus was his familiar, and thus Kuro's responsibility. Competent wizards prevented their familiars from causing trouble by unsummoning them. Kuro was not that kind of wizard, so he kept Autolycus out of trouble through a combination of feeding and pleading. He was frequently tempted to just pop the little pest. Wizard wisdom was that familiars were merely extensions of their makers. They could be disassembled and their memories reabsorbed at their creator's leisure. Autolycus had been out and about for too long, though, and had developed ideas of his own, including the notion that he'd like to keep existing. Kuro had some sympathy for that desire. The fact that the tiny menace had nearly perished while rescuing Kuro and company from prison earned him some additional affection. Affection he was rapidly eroding by stealing Kuro's food. Food arrived daily via Luton Post. To be more precise, ingredients did. Kuro was happy to cook for himself. It made him feel mildly competent, which was welcome after days attempting to learn magic and math under Ms. Crawley's tutelage. She was a brilliant wizard and creative with her lessons. Any success Kuro had was entirely to her credit. She seemed to consider his failures to be hers as well. It was exhausting for both. As a small act of recognition for her dedication, he baked her cookies. "How are these so good?" she asked while shoving a third one into her mouth. They were simple oatmeal bacon cookies, so far as he was concerned. Perhaps the fresh honey he had gathered from the bees in the spring quarter gave them an aromatic boost, but she consumed them as though she'd not eaten in a week. Perhaps an extended stay in Niflheim prison made one appreciate home baking more. Regardless, they served the dual purpose of expressing his gratitude and shortening a lesson on exponential functions. It also had the unexpected effect of adding another mouth to feed. Ms. Crawley was being sent frozen, pre-made meals that were, in her words, nutritionally balanced and not much else. The same as Kuro had been sent before he rebelled. "Why don't you cook for yourself?" he asked. "The Luton bring me fresh ingredients almost every day." Watching a full adult, a teacher no less, try to find a way to avoid admitting to a 15-year-old that they lack a basic life skill is extremely entertaining. Kuro couldn't let it go on for too long, though. He owed his teacher a great deal, and she was still thin from her time in prison, so he invited her to start joining him for dinners. Days later, while Kuro was cooking a spicy spaghetti and beetball dish, a Luton popped in with a letter for him. She asked about the aromas, and suddenly he had a second guest. Once one Luton knew, they all did. Kuro was regularly feeding between 4 and 11 additional, although very small, people each night. They didn't even bother telling him how many were coming. He just had to guess based on what they'd left in the larder. He was fairly certain they were messing with him too. They'd sometimes send him things with clear purpose. Sacks of potatoes, ground beef, and hamburger buns weren't hard to interpret. And Luton were well known for their love of Blandland-style junk food. More often, however, they delivered collections of ingredients that no sensible person would attempt to make a meal of. One night it was mangoes, radishes, fish fingers, and a 20-pound bag of flour. They weren't the best dumplings he'd ever eaten, but they turned out better than expected. "Have you thought about what courses you'd like to take?" asked Ms. Crawley as she paused between bites, giving herself time to decipher what exactly she was eating. "A bit," replied Kuro, and devoured another of his creations in an attempt to avoid the topic. They were allowed to choose what to study in high school. The simple set schedule of junior high, where he shared every class with all the other students of his year, was gone. Everyone could take different courses to suit their interests. "Have you asked anyone for advice?" she inquired. It was delivered gently, as if she were genuinely curious about his process and not ready to release a barely contained flood of suggestions. He did not, however, want her advice. It would be sound, well considered, and based on experience and wisdom earned from her years working at the school. What she would not tell him was to just take all the same classes as his friends, which is what he wanted. She would also tell him that it was impossible to do so because his friends weren't all taking the same classes as each other. Arthur was aiming to be a hound, Marie needed to learn to be a queen, and Charlie wanted to care for monsters. There was almost no overlap among the courses they'd be taking. Instead of yielding to Ms. Crawley's offer, Kuro engaged with the half-dozen Luton who had shown up for dinner. He was starting to know some of them by name, which was harder than it should be. Being so small, barely waist-high to a human, Luton's height differences were hardly noticeable, and further blurred by their consistent wearing of pointed wool caps. Their small brown eyes and large pointed noses, an area of great variety among wizards, were almost identical. Their ears, though, were quite unique, as was the way each braided beads and buttons into their beards and mustaches. They all wore very similar woven red sashes, but each was subtly personalized. The real challenge for keeping them straight, though, was the fact that they refused to stay still. Luton believed distance to be an illusion and location a state of mind. With barely a thought, they could instantly be anywhere they had ever been. So they came and went as they pleased, ignoring inconveniences like walls and continents, and often trading places with each other over the course of the meal. That meant the Luton who had sat next to Kuro at the start of dinner was not the same by the end. Sometimes they'd decide they had somewhere else to be in the middle of the meal, and some friend would pop in to take their place. That evening had been particularly unstable, as the Luton appeared to be taking turns either enjoying or daring each other to eat the dumplings. It wasn't clear. "Do you like them?" he asked the young woman currently beside him, whom he was moderately confident was named Shingle. "I don't think so," she replied in her small chipmunk-like voice, then took another big bite. "Can I have the recipe?" "Are you stealing my recipes so you can feed these things to students?" Kuro asked, unsure if he was flattered or offended. Shingle, however, was no longer beside him to answer. She was at the end of the table. The response came instead from his new neighbor, an elder Luton named Dugnut.
"Not at all,"
he scoffed at the accusation.
"It's not stealing if we ask for it."
He couldn't argue the logic. It was better justification than he'd used for most of his thefts. Conceding, he fetched some paper and pen and tried his best to remember how to make the dumplings, although his instructions did not include pilfering the cumin from Summerhill. "Were you able to finish the worksheet on cuneiform inscriptions?" Ms. Crawley asked after he had finished authoring the recipe. Hidden in the question was a generous offer to stick around and help him with it. "I should get the dishes done. Are you finished eating?" Crow asked as a transparent means of avoiding the subject. "Yes, thank you," she said, her eyebrows lifted just above the rims of her circular glasses, and the left corner of her mouth raised ever so slightly as she handed over her empty dish. She could see right through him and was quietly enjoying that fact. He knew it, too, and it was infuriating. She had vastly more experience dealing with teenagers than he had being one. It put him at a terrible disadvantage. "Shall we use the high school enchanting room for our lessons tomorrow?" Ms. Crawley suggested as she reclaimed the gray morning coat she'd set aside during dinner and headed out the door. "The enchanting facilities are less battered than those in the junior high, and it saves me commuting down the butte." "Sounds good," replied Crow as he gathered the Luton dishes. They blinked away as he walked along benches. It had bothered him, earlier in the summer, that they left without a word, but he'd come to understand that they were being polite and that they considered getting out of his way to be an act of kindness. He was already so slow, given that he could only move as fast and far as his feet could carry him, and slowing him further with idle chatter would be inconsiderate. He had gotten used to it and come to expect it. Perhaps too much. He was attending to the stack of plates and silverware more than to the occupants of the bench along which he was walking. Those occupants were too engrossed in their conversation to notice his approach, and so he walked straight into Shingle, fully expecting her to vanish before he made contact. Instead, he crashed into her, surprising both of them. As would any surprised Luton, she blinked away. Crow could not blink. Of course he couldn't. He wasn't a Luton. He was, however, half Luton, which seemed to mean he could half blink. He couldn't do it himself, but he could piggyback if he happened to be holding on to a real Luton when they did it. The Lodge Luton knew about that, but weren't concerned because Crow had been anchored by the guard. They knew he couldn't blink or be blinked because of the enchanted silver bracelet around his wrist. Removing it would be both criminal and explosive. What they didn't know, what Crow hadn't told them, was that the bracelet was a fake. The real one had been swapped for a forgery with less magical power than a number 2 pencil. Having the bench beneath him turn suddenly into an uneven mass of shifting metal objects, and the oil lamplit Autumn Lodge dining hall replaced with pitch darkness, was disorienting. Crow, who under normal circumstances would have been able to recover, tripped and fell while dishware crashed and shattered around him, their clatter echoing around a huge, cavernous space. He could see nothing, but he could hear Shingle and her feelings on the situation.
"Oh, I messed up,"
she squeaked. Crow was distracted from her self-admonishments, though, by the uncanny and overwhelming sense that a wall was looking at him. Thank you for listening to Stealing from Wizards. If you liked our show, please consider rating or reviewing on iTunes. If you want to support this podcast or just can't wait for the next chapter, the full book is available on Amazon, Kobo, and Indigo. Our theme music was written by Camille Saint-Saëns, transcribed by Franz Liszt, performed by Rebecca Verdun, and used with permission. This episode was produced by Jim Tigwell.